On March 9th, 2017, Boston Globe writer Billy Baker wrote an article titled "The biggest threat facing middle-aged men isn't smoking or obesity, it's loneliness." Now, there's a lot to debate there regarding whether that's even a title so much as it is a thesis statement, but those semantics aside, this article exploded in popularity. It so happens that a lot of men found themselves empathizing with Billy's laments of the rigid, overscheduled demands of the American dream: work, family, carpools, and communities. In the article, Baker even referred to his limited social life as a sequence of accidents of proximity, friends he'd made at work or at the gym, by a mere virtue of seeing them often enough. Now, Billy didn't use this article, nor his follow-up article, to complain fruitlessly, unnecessarily. He pins the issue of loneliness on a whole number of things, mainly the American capitalist system, which requires rigorous, unflinching loyalty and time, but also himself, as he grew increasingly aware throughout the process of writing that his deteriorating relationships had a lot to do with him too. He allowed them to languish, neglecting to nurture them, and so those relationships died. In the years since the article, the male loneliness epidemic has been a topic of hot debate. Does it exist? To what extent does it exist? Which demographics specifically does it affect? And if so, what is the cause? What is the solution? Is there a female loneliness epidemic too? Now, I think about these questions sometimes. Specifically, since I'm not male, it's something I observe from the other side of the fence. I'm a fembot, a roasty, a femoid, and while we do have our own brand of loneliness, it is apparently not the excessively lonely road that so many of our modern male counterparts are walking. I saw a tweet once joking about being assigned Silent Hill 3 at birth, and like, it's obviously a joke, but also, it's kind of real. Silent Hill 3 has always been my favourite installment in the Silent Hill franchise. It speaks volumes to the experiences of women in a myriad of different ways. Also, I think Valtiel is extraordinarily cool. But this tongue-in-cheek awareness has only drawn my own needlessly watchful attention to my relationship with Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 has the best individual story of the entire franchise, taking you on a miserable rollercoaster that only gets worse and worse each go-around, while the watching audience throws stones at you whenever you pass by, and they're all made of lips. And yet you keep getting back on it, buckling up, and hoping things will be better this time around. The setup, the atmosphere, the puzzles, the reveals, the symbolism, it's all top notch, and so much of that is due to how you, the player, interpret it off the back of your own life experiences. And see, despite loving Silent Hill 2 for all these reasons, and being able to discuss it for hours, I never really resonated with James or his story. I can't relate to James whatsoever. And no, before you say, I don't need to relate to James to enjoy the story, obviously, but I still do love the story, as you'll come to learn throughout this video. I just noticed that I related a hell of a lot more to Heather from Silent Hill 3, though I've never been lured to my mythical hometown to give birth to God, so it had to be for other reasons than her literal core character arc. Rather, as I embarked on my next Silent Hill 2 playthrough, I began to pay particular attention to James and his own journey through the town, what his own manifestations mean, both the town he's in and the monsters that it spawns. And I thought, damn, this guy is super lonely. Spoilers for Silent Hill 2 ahead. Now folks, before we dig into the tragedy of James Sunderland, let me dig into the tragedy of you missing out on this fantastic offer by Brilliant. Brilliant.org is a hands-on interactive learning website focusing on helping you build a toolkit of incredibly useful skills, specifically maths, data science, and computer science, some of the most challenging subjects I've ever had to face in my life. If you've always wanted to learn a skill but can't find the time to join some intensive coding bootcamp, consider Brilliant. Brilliant offers bite-sized interactive learning lessons tailored to your specific learning requirements. Just tell Brilliant what you want to learn and what you already know, and let them build you your very own personalized learning course. You can do as much or as little as you want, set your own personal learning goals, and work through Brilliant's catalogue at your own pace. Brilliant is a learning service for busy people. More lessons are added every single month, so you'll never be short of help when you're looking to polish up on your existing skills or learn something entirely new. There's always something new to discover with Brilliant. So visit my URL today over at brilliant.org/merkkk to get started for free for 30 days, and the first 200 of you to visit will receive 20% off an annual plan. That's brilliant.org/merkkk for 30 days free, and if you're quick enough, 20% off your annual plan. For those of you joining today because you like the sound of my voice in the background while you grind totems for Endwalker relics on Final Fantasy XIV, James Sunderland is the protagonist of Silent Hill 2. He's not present nor referenced whatsoever in Silent Hill 1 or 3, unless you count a throwaway line in 3 about a man going missing in the town, and his story is as self-contained as the later excessive self-referential fanservice allowed it to be. We can only be so lucky that he didn't appear in Homecoming as a Force ghost, but I barely dare say that out loud. I don't want to be giving anybody ideas. We meet James fresh out of the car right at the mouth of the beast, at some rest stop up the road from the Silent Hill graveyard. The door of his vehicle is still open, even as he takes a quick peek at himself in the bathroom and prepares for the journey that's ahead of him. See, James has received a letter, only the nature of this letter is peculiar. It's from Mary, his wife, who died 3 years prior. At least, this is what James believes. Spoilers for the story, but we come to learn, and it's very much implied, that Mary only died the previous day and her corpse is chilling on the back seat. You see, the letter is a delusion for James, and he's on a journey to Silent Hill in order to kill himself so that he can be together with Mary in death. However, this would be a short game if our only obligation was to press X to accelerate into the lake. No, James has some shit to work out first, and this is how our masterfully told tale of psychological horror begins. To put it lightly, James is a mess. The true nature of Mary's illness that led to her death is unraveled across the course of the story, culminating in a huge reveal right at the end. As James sits in the armchair recliner of room 312, the room he and Mary stayed in during their vacation in Silent Hill, he sees for himself undisputable proof that he murdered his own wife, a VHS recording of him kissing her on the forehead before smothering her with a pillow. Originally, the developers intended for the VHS tape to include audio of Mary's muffled screams as she fought for survival. However, for whatever reason, this was ultimately removed from the final cut, so it's entirely up to you as to whether or not you believe Mary wanted to die. In fact, that's probably why the developers removed it, since it was probably far too on the nose, since it eliminated any doubt that Mary wanted to live in those final moments. In flashbacks and letters, we see Mary struggle a lot with whether she wants to overcome her illness or whether she wants to hurry up and die to get it over with. The removal of that audio better enables players to interpret the scene, and as a result, James's motivations, how they see fit. Personally, I believe that Mary probably changed her mind and didn't want to be smothered to death since she fought so much right until the end, but I won't hate you if you disagree with me. Mary's reveal is foreshadowed to us throughout the game, but in ways better recognised on a replay. Most directly, James's letter from Mary, a full letter written in her handwriting, magically goes blank after he encounters Pyramid Head, one of the later bosses, for the last time. Pyramid Head's sole intention is to force James to confront what he's done, and once James comes to terms with this, the letter simply cannot exist, proving that James's motivations for returning to Silent Hill are just the product of some hasty delusion. What's more, this is emphasised further by the body that can be found slumped in a chair in the Woodside apartments early in the game, right after James gets his first handgun. In the making of Silent Hill 2, the developers explain that the man sitting in the chair is actually James himself and is a manifestation of James's imagination. Considering this is the exact position that James slumps in after viewing the aforementioned VHS tape in the hotel, this is some heavy foreshadowing that a first-time player isn't going to be able to appreciate properly. Now, Silent Hill 2 does have multiple endings, a trait common with the entirety of the Silent Hill franchise, so it's no surprise, but some of those endings are impossible to access without first finishing the game one full time. This encourages the player to play at least twice. If you want a 10-star run, you have to get every single ending at least once. The mechanics of the game encourage you to try to experience the story multiple times, and the perspective you'll begin to build from watching aspects of James's story will inevitably change, as will James. James changes throughout replays of this game. What I really enjoy about James's character is that he's a person I liked less and less with every playthrough. During your first stint through Silent Hill, he is your protagonist. You root for him. You want him to survive. Some of his dialogue is funny and charming. He seems a little bit airheaded, but ultimately he's shown as a man determined to find his wife and bring her home. Meaning that the reveal of him being the one to murder Mary is a betrayal to us, the player. You almost don't want to believe it. Yet by the 5th or 6th playthrough, I found myself regarding James with the same quiet caution as I would an electric fence. I would give him a very wide berth. But what I really began to see in subsequent playthroughs, what really began to bleed through the cracks, was how severely sheerly pathetic he is. As I was writing this script, I ran into a tweet by a streamer where he ranked the most pathetic survival horror protagonists. James Sunderland sat heavily at the bottom, and I concurred. While James rises to the challenge, ostensibly our protagonist, he fulfills the requirements of this role as flimsily as possible. James lacks the ability to form relationships of any depth with others. The relationships he does have, he stands by and stares at as they rot. He finds his strength in the strength of his delusions, as symbolized by Pyramid Head himself, an entity that vanishes when those delusions crumble, because there is no strength in his truth. If we were to draft a cursory checklist of stereotypical masculine traits, James would tick them all. Stoic, independent, physically fit, able to fight, wears a green army jacket, but the more we play, the more we see that this is a smokescreen, hiding the true reality of James. James is a terminally lonely man living out his final day after the death of his only friend, a woman he eventually began to resent before killing her, both out of mercy and a desperate selfish desire to be free of his burden. Mary and James's dynamic has always been infinitely interesting to me, specifically because it's a case of a young couple, Mary is 25, James is 29, where the wife is terminally ill. I don't know what served as the specific inspiration for a couple dynamic like this. It's not one we see much of, if at all, in gaming, and it runs so parallel to reality. See, according to a 2009 article written by Big Brains at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, a woman is 6 times more likely to be separated or divorced soon after a diagnosis of cancer or multiple sclerosis than if a man in the relationship is the patient, with women seeing a 20.8% risk of being divorced compared to a man's 3% risk. The reason for this is debated, but the main consensus is that male counterparts tend to struggle to commit to being the caregiver for a sick spouse, although longer marriages were more likely to remain stable than newly wedded couples. One article from The Guardian suggests that men tend to view their partner getting sick in almost a mechanical way. They see it as a problem to be solved. They can separate out the obvious and immediate physical tasks that result from the illness, but other caregiving requirements are left unconsidered, such as emotional care or housework. And as far as James Sunderland goes, I think this hits the nail pretty square on the head. James can't fix Mary, and as the illness wears on and he can't definitively soothe her desperate, frustrated rage at the hand she's been dealt, he basically just gives up. He turns to alcohol and leaves her in the hospital alone for weeks and weeks. The only power in the situation is the power he finally takes for himself, killing her by smothering her with a pillow. I always wondered what inspired this. Did the writers see this phenomenon cropping up across the healthcare world and think it would be an interesting thing to examine? Did they see one of their family members go through something similar? Or, in my interpretation, did they ask themselves, if my wife got sick, what would be the worst thing I could do? James's propensity for spousal neglect, specifically of a sick spouse, feels so specific. It's so specific that they're married, so specific that he is violating the in sickness and death vows he no doubt made, so specific that she is sick, so specific that they are young. It's a perfect arrangement of a broken main character and his wife and victim, without needing to rely on contrived tropes, but rather on the cold reality of statistics and unfortunately common fate. If anything, I imagine James encouraged a few men to be a little bit nicer to their wives after playing. But you say, Kirsty, my silly English fruitcake, men have sick wives all the time. They aren't all taking a one-way trip to Silent Hill with their bird's corpse on the back seat. And I say, yes, but James is one thing many of them aren't. He is truly, abysmally, devastatingly lonely. Beyond the simple answer of because otherwise the game wouldn't exist, I always wondered what brought James to Silent Hill out of everyone else in the world who just so happened to have killed their spouse out of desperate grief. Yeah, James and Mary had vacationed in Silent Hill previously, but I linger on this question in particular due to how uniquely Silent Hill 2 stands out from the rest. I wondered if initially Silent Hill 2 was intended to be the start of some episodic series of games, each one of them telling a unique story with fresh characters and fresh monsters, in which case James's standalone story would make plenty of sense. But Silent Hill 3 is a delayed continuation of Silent Hill 1, and Silent Hill Origins even serves as a prequel to it all, which disrupts that line of thinking and takes us right back to the cult stuff. I actually quite like Homecoming, despite it being some of the most desperate, pandering fan service in gaming, and that game even implies that the protagonist may be related related to Mary. I mean, come on guys, let the woman rest. Still, lending to the uniqueness of Silent Hill 2 is the loneliness. James's loneliness specifically. What drags him right back to Silent Hill 2 is the perfect combination of rampant male loneliness and disconnect. He is a victim that the town can exploit due to his complete absence of support and his fracturing mental health. That's why he's here. If you pay attention, which I can't really recommend, but if you do, you'll notice that the otherworld in Silent Hill 2 is different from the otherworld that features in every single other installment of the Silent Hill franchise. Silent Hill 3, for example, features a more hostile, extreme version of the otherworld, based heavily on the imagery of Jacob's Ladder, a movie I watched specifically for the sake of this video and somewhat enjoyed. It's all corrugated metal, dark corners, pitch black night skies, and blood red rust. Shattered Memories has an icy otherworld. Silent Hill Downpour has an otherworld whose symbolism is closely associated with water. Considering Silent Hill 2 is widely considered to be the best game in the series, Sunderland's otherworld is easily the most muted. Horror visuals are kept to a minimum. The only jump scare in the game needs to be specifically sought after and prodded for it to work. And beyond creatures appearing unexpectedly out of the dark or the fog, I would argue that there is no functional horror whatsoever to Silent Hill 2's otherworld. Rather, Silent Hill 2's otherworld is loneliness incarnate. As we wander the streets of Silent Hill, we walk through empty roads, past houses that look like they're covered in scaffolding. Doors are locked, windows are empty, it's cold. The denizens aren't exactly people we can communicate with, never mind survive. And I always thought this was indicative of true loneliness. Any other vestige of humanity is not only dead, but also wearing the same clothing as James. The corpses that dot the streets of Silent Hill 2, the entirety of the game in fact, are all just James's character model draped across the pavements throughout this foggy town. The victims of Silent Hill 2 are just his reflection staring back at him, a grim warning of what a single mistake will lead to. Still, the town isn't hostile. It doesn't spitefully toy with James, it's just cold. The empty, faceless, featureless buildings that James awkwardly shuffles past serve him no purpose. They're not relevant to him. Similar to wandering through a crowd of people you don't know, you are surrounded by entities, and you might even make eye contact with a few of them, but functionally within that moment they are set dressing, scaffolding, faceless, uncaring. James is surrounded by cold facades. No one cares about him. And as the game bleeds on, this cold detachment combines with James's fracturing mental state. The prison forces James to jump down increasingly deep holes, leading him impossibly deep below the earth, only to step out onto the dock above sea level, like nothing happened. The hotel is a mishmash of different maps and routes that fold in on each other like wormholes. The only goal is finding Mary, and the only places of note are places that directly further James's goal in reaching her. And although James meets a small cast of characters on his travels throughout Silent Hill, he refuses to cultivate any platonic intimacy with them. As with Baker's article, James's connections are accidents of proximity, familiar faces. He never ever makes a single effort to foster connection, even when it would take the smallest amount of effort at no cost whatsoever to him. This, many have argued, causes some of them to tip over the edge and be lost forever, when just showing a bit of genuine human concern and empathy from the beginning might have changed the course of events. Instead, James focuses on his wife. As far as we know, James has no other friends in the entire world. He might do, but there's a specific emphasis on James's lack of connections in the story of Silent Hill 2. As far as we're concerned, he has nobody but Mary, hence the extreme psychotic break he experienced when he decided to put her out of her misery. And, alongside our statistics on divorced sick women, male reliance upon their spouses is just as prevalent and just as toxic. Sarah Coghlan, country director for Movember UK, and a woman I would literally fight, simperingly observed that men are expected to spend time with their wives, and that's normal and natural and very healthy, but at the cost perhaps of friendships they need to invest in, which places so much of that blame on the women in these men's lives when, Sarah, if the man is spending 15 hours per week with his wife, and then his wife is also spending 15 hours per week with him, and they both work, and they both have household duties, I don't see why we're not also suggesting that that comes at the cost of her friendships. If she can still find time to organise a brunch at the weekend, the man's lack of friends isn't on her, but Thanks, Sarah. Jude Doyle, an actual man with actual introspection, provides a more nuanced take in his article, The Male Loneliness Epidemic Does Not Exist, where he explains that he has two intimacy settings, either you are my best friend and I will literally love you for the rest of my life and then die for you, or excuse me sir, can you point the way to the restroom? And he never learned how to navigate that middle range where most friendships reside. Relationships are easier when nobody has to shoulder the weight of being someone's only connection to humanity. Nonetheless, we are told that men refuse to cultivate platonic intimacy and dump everything on their partners, men like me. And it's stunning how much this line of logic also applies to James. James meets several people across the course of his travels through Silent Hill. Angela Orozco, a troubled and vulnerable victim of sexual abuse; Eddie, the traumatized and volatile victim of bullying; Maria, a woman literally born from a wish, whose sole purpose revolves entirely around James; and Laura, a little girl who just beats up on him whenever she fancies it. Queen shit. James, despite having ample opportunity and all the time in the world, considering he keeps insisting that his wife has been dead for 3 years, sits in the latter half of those intimate settings. Excuse me ma'am, can you point the way to Silent Hill? He says to a lost and struggling Angela, sitting by a grave in the foggy graveyard. Ian Taylor of BBC Science Focus suggests that if you've ever watched a sitcom, you know how it goes. Men have superficial or transactional relationships with each other and bond by banter as they watch sport and drink beer. Women, in contrast, have deep and emotionally vulnerable conversations marked by shared secrets and interpersonal closeness. The funny thing is, these sitcom stereotypes are borne out by research. While I don't entirely agree with these observations, being that secrets are often shared by women during moments of banter when watching or drinking, we see the contrast between James and Mary and Laura, a young girl who attended the same hospital as Mary during the course of her illness. Laura is 8 years old and she is inexplicably just in Silent Hill. She is in this town. The opening cinematic implies that she hitched a ride with Eddie Drombowski, a man we see across our travels to varying levels of mental stability, but personally, I don't really believe she is here, nor that she necessarily exists. I think she is another entity from Silent Hill, a mechanism that demonstrates the depth of Mary's relationships against the barren wasteland of James's in a single breath. I know it's a really tenuous link, and bear with me, but James, Maria, Eddie, and Laura are all platinum blondes, and for that extremely vapid reason, I have taken to assume that they are all segments of James's psyche that manifest to force him to confront aspects of himself that he'd probably rather not. But whatever, I know, you can poke holes in that if you like, but I don't think that they're real. Laura was an orphan who stayed in the hospital with Mary. Mary had suggested to Laura prior that, should things have panned out differently, she would have liked to have adopted Laura, a promise that Laura holds James personally responsible for, and reasonably in contempt of. Still, the magnitude of her love for Mary highlights just how easily Mary was able to make meaningful connections, even in her darkest moments. If Laura is real, she, an 8-year-old, has travelled a long way to Silent Hill just for the chance to find Mary. Yet, even as Laura opens up to James throughout the course of Silent Hill 2, he never ever seems to care or begin to connect emotionally with her on any level. He isn't so much disinterested as he is just barely present in any moment. He's on an astonishing amount of mental ping. This is disappointing given the apparent bond between Laura and Mary, that James doesn't even begin to try to put effort into the relationship for the sake of his deceased wife. James stumbles through Silent Hill 2 in a fugue state, both literally and metaphorically. There's a heavy emphasis on the dreamlike state of Silent Hill 2. His dialogue is stunted and random. He blunders from plot point to plot point with the same mindless understanding you have when hopping from A to B in your dream. And even in the opening scene, we see him waving his hand in front of his face in the same way you might check you were awake. Accordingly, we see the same with the people he meets, people that he could help and be helped by, but are considered to be, by James, just individuals that he blunders into. James is absolutely incapable of forging connections with the people around him, and the more you replay Silent Hill 2, the more you shake your fist at every missed opportunity. Instead, Mary shoulders the weight of being James's sole connection to reality, and when he kills her out of a strange combination of selfish mercy, he loses that connection too. In Melinda Moyer's article, The Epidemic of Male Loneliness, Dr. Niobe Way observed that loneliness often becomes an added burden for girls and women. Many men only open up to their girlfriends and wives, which seems to be much the case for James and Mary again. Imagine if he had a therapist. Imagine how we'd have one less horror game to enjoy. Another attribute unique to Silent Hill 2, at least of the first 4 4 original games, as far as I know, is the suicide ending. Yes, of Silent Hill 1, 2, 3 and The Room, the only ending wherein a character takes his own life is Silent Hill 2, the in-water ending, and likely the ending you'll get by accident on your first playthrough of the game. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, because the writers weren't lazy shitheads who drop a suicide ending on a game the moment they realise they've written themselves into a corner and now need to decide between it was all a dream and then James killed himself, but also because, like, James is lonely. James is the quintessential lonely male. He goes to work, comes home, pipes his wife, and when his wife gets sick, he just goes to work. Small tangent, but I was always curious about what illness Mary had, being that James only ever refers to it as that disease, until I stumbled upon a fan theory by a Reddit user that I've linked in the description. Whilst in the Historical Society, James learned that the Brookhaven Hospital was built to treat victims of an unknown epidemic, a mysterious plague that spread from around the lake. Mary comments that during their time in Silent Hill, she and James spent the whole day by the lakeside, just staring at the water. Although you could pose the question, why didn't James catch it? I feel like the potential sentient malevolence of the town might account for that specific prod of cruelty, and bring the in-water theory full circle. It's also a lot easier to get behind than other fan theories I've encountered over the years, like ones that suggested Mary had syphilis. Yes, the sexually transmitted disease. Anyway, as we learn towards the conclusion of Silent Hill 2, James did not adapt very well to Mary's sickness. Mary was given 3 years to live, her condition was incurable, with limited treatment options, which often were unable to soothe the symptoms that Mary had to endure, meaning that Mary's terminal illness left her in a lot of physical pain. Her body broke out in sores and rashes that left her severely disfigured, destroying her self-esteem and breaking her spirit. Mary was in the hospital for a long time, meaning that all her needs were met, however clinically. James merely had to visit her at the end of a long day at work, but as is revealed to us, he struggled even to commit to that. Mary's disfigurement made her prone to intense, wrathful mood swings. She would lash out at him, then cry, and the disease brought out tensions between them. During Mary's final days, she was allowed to return to her home with James to stay with him for a bit so that he could see her before she died, but as we learn, being Mary's caretaker quickly became a burden to James, which feels contradictory. How long was she there to have been a burden? Was it like 3 days before he gave up and killed her? The timeline for Mary's disease is a little bit off the wall, but we'll have to take it at face value and assume that James literally could no longer be asked to look after her after like 72 hours. Still, Mary's story concludes and leads to the belief that James is really returning to Silent Hill with the intention of dying to be reunited with Mary, which is, by default, how his story always ends, with his own death. Masahiro Ito, the art director for Silent Hill, commented on Twitter that he made Pyramid Head with the in-water ending in mind as the canon ending, a belief that was echoed by Sunderland's voice actor Guy Seehee, who felt the bittersweet and tragic tone fit the story better. And I agree, while I do prefer the Leave ending for its optimism and the joke endings for their levity, they always felt a bit janky, a bit unfinished, like the story hadn't quite been wrapped up. Especially the Maria ending, which sees James leave the town with Maria in the car. She mysteriously begins coughing as the game comes to a close, implying that the cycle is about to start all over again, and making me wonder off the record whether using James's model as every corpse in the game had time loop connotations. Probably not. The in-water ending feels right, especially considering that James was never heard from again and realistically wouldn't be able to return to society after committing literal homicide, so it's a sad one that I go with too. Being that men have died 3 to 5 times more often than women by suicide since the 1950s, this felt like it looped in too. Combining the lack of suicide endings in other Silent Hill games, a phenomenon I have considered to be a crude cop-out 95% of the time, and the pattern behaviour of chronic male illness we see in James, this ending makes a lot of sense. Suicide is a consistent theme across the course of Silent Hill 2's story, not only in James's arc, but also in the arc of Angela Orozco and an unnamed character whose final note can be found on the roof of Brookhaven Hospital, off which he threw himself. The contents of the note are, in my opinion, not especially relevant to James's specific situation. I've seen a few people theorise that it was Mary's notes or Angela's notes due to the references to family, not being being allowed to go outside and feeling sick from medication, but neither of them were hospitalized in Silent Hill. Rather, I think this is the record of one patient's life that just so happens to have themes applicable to the lives of Mary, Angela, and James. Most of the days in that note feel relevant to Mary, specifically days 9, 11, and 13, which feature heavy themes of quarantine and medicine, with quotes like, "Nothing to do, still not allowed to go outside," and "The meds made me feel sick today. If I'm only better when I'm drugged, then who am I anyway?" These quotations play heavily on Mary's feelings of useless redundancy. Being terminally ill for 3 years is a long, long time. I feel like anybody would feel the urge to use that time as efficiently as they could to live out the experiences they've always wanted to live, but Mary's severe physical deterioration forced her to stay in bed. It's unclear whether she had to be properly quarantined with PPE, and that's the reason, or whether the illness simply wasted her away so fast that she couldn't walk again, but the frustration she felt comes through really clearly throughout the game. Angela's experience most closely resonates with day 10, with the comment, "I know I'm pathetic and weak, not everyone can be strong." This excerpt perfectly encapsulates Angela's arc, which we'll cover later. James's experience specifically seemed to resonate with May 12. The day 12 entry uses statements like, "Can it really be such a sin to run instead of fight? It may be selfish, but it's what I want. It's too hard," to highlight James's cowardly nature. At his very core, he is a man who runs from his problems instead of facing them head on, and this is precisely why Pyramid Head is such a prominent threat in his story. Silent Hill literally had to create a creature just to force him to listen. James, you are crazy for this. But the biggest consistent theme is water, specifically rain, which the patient observes as occurring daily during the time they keep the journal. On the final day, the weather is clear, and this is the day it appears the patient jumped from the hospital roof, ending their life. This mimics the resolute peace James finds at the end of the In Water ending. As we hear the sound of his car picking up speed along the road, he comments, "What was I afraid of? Without you, Mary, I've got nothing. Now we can be together." In an op-ed for the New York Times, Magdalene J. Taylor explored the male loneliness epidemic through the lens of a historic rate of sexlessness in men under 30. As part of her explorations on the phenomenon, Magdalene presented a potential solution. She encouraged men to fuck their way out of isolation, to restore the balance lost through their chronic lack of sex, and consequently turned a blind eye to the inevitably miserable consequences for the women churned underfoot by such a demand that would somehow simultaneously be emotionally vacant and emotionally desperate. This is something that resonates when Maria is introduced to the story shortly after the first major section of the game, the apartments. This is shortly after we have had our first fight with Pyramid Head and are likely well acquainted with the gameplay loop of Silent Hill 2. Maria is found in Rosewater Park looking fairly confused and fairly familiar. She is Mary's identical twin with a few small differences. She is of good health, showcasing a vibrant blonde bob and an excellent figure. She is dressed provocatively, for the standards of the noughties, and she is much flirtier, a little wilder, again, by the standards of the noughties. I feel awful for Maria because despite clearly being some product of Silent Hill's malicious manifestation magic, she is also completely sentient. She was quite literally magicked into existence shortly before we met her. I won't go far enough to say she has her own goals, since she's not had the time nor space to actually put any together, but she definitely has a lot to sort out mentally in the brief period that she exists. Now, there are a few conflicting theories about the real nature of Maria. On one hand, there's the suggestion that she is the antagonist of Silent Hill 2, a succubus demon who punishes James and exploits his grieving bargaining by keeping him trapped in Silent Hill, a theory that is backed up by the Maria ending, which appears to be the only ending that keeps James trapped in a loop that has him returning to the town over and over again. She repeatedly reincarnates across the course of the game, and also appears to be in the early stages of the same illness that killed Mary, a set of symptoms that clearly trigger James's PTSD from watching his wife slowly die in agony. The same theory suggests that the final boss, Mary strung up on the hospital bed, is Maria's true succubus self. On the flip side, and the theory I personally subscribe to, is that Maria is merely a confused clone of Mary, born from a wish, as her side story's title suggests. My reasoning for this is two-pronged. Firstly, Maria carries a heavy butterfly motif, a motif that turns to black moths when she is revealed as the final boss. While the black moths represent death, the butterfly represents a second birth. From the cocoon of Mary's hospital bed, Mary, the plain Jane caterpillar, returned with a flourish as the beautiful and visually striking Maria, with a new tattoo tattoo of a butterfly on her tummy to represent that. Secondly, Maria is clearly some kind of supernatural clone. Like Silent Hill just printed a copy of Mary directly from James's brain. She hates being alone. She reveals that she has Mary's memories, that she has Mary's illness, but at the same time she is fairly autonomous. In some ways it's like Silent Hill has dropped a blank slate version of Mary into James's life, with a revolver that contains a single bullet, might I add, with the intention of letting her judge him for herself. She may be just as much an executioner as Pyramid Head, although she dishes the gun. Maria's role in this story is abundantly, tragically brilliant. Simultaneously, she is an item that James doesn't really give all that much of a shit about, and a thinking, feeling person. Maria, to us, is obviously a human. So human that it's difficult to imagine her as a projection of James's wish for Mary's health and sexuality. She has Mary's memories, which are unlocked slowly as she interacts with more of the world. Functionally, she is a thinking, feeling, living clone, and she's very confused. It's so frustrating for us as the player, being limited in our interactions by James. All of the women in Silent Hill, Maria, Mary, Laura, and Angela, are lost in this black hole that is James's personhood. While we can detect a richness of character in each one of them, their own motivations, personalities, dreams, goals, turn-offs, etc., James is only able to interact with them on the most basic level. Like watching your mum try and find a local restaurant's menu on Google, our lack of agency in the situation upsets and alienates us. It is a frustrating experience for us, the player, who can see the potential in every interaction and yet is powerless to do nothing. James sees Maria as a cardboard cutout and treats her as such too. So while we can see her depth of character, we can only engage with her as an object, and we can never help her. While James's sexual frustrations are symbolized by Maria's design and purpose, his desire for women, his need to be needed, his involuntary 3-year celibacy, we also see it symbolized in Pyramid Head from an opposing perspective: male power, stoicism, strength. Now, I know it's a common theory that Pyramid Head represents James's sexual frustrations, but personally, I don't necessarily subscribe to that, at least not all the way. Takeyoshi Sato, one of the writers for Silent Hill 2, explained that Pyramid Head's abuse of the monsters was intentionally made erotic. Psychological horror has to shake a person's heart deeply. If we want to scare, shake, or touch the users, we have to think about sex and death deeply. And from that, and from the behaviour we see Pyramid Head engage in, I can definitely see a situation in which Pyramid Head isn't necessarily satisfying a need, but more killing enemies in a manner that would intentionally disturb James. James doesn't seem like the kind of guy to be secure enough about himself to take a gay joke well, so putting him against a bigger, buffer enemy that literally shags a mannequin to death in front of him would probably be his worst nightmare. Pyramid Head plays on his deepest insecurities, and the deepest insecurities of toxic masculinity. Pyramid Head's inspiration was a quote from Jacob's Ladder. "The only thing that burns in hell is the part of you that won't let go of life, your memories, your attachments. They burn them all away, but they're not punishing you, they're freeing your soul. But if you've made your peace, then the devils are really angels, freeing you from the earth. It's just a matter of how you look at it, that's all." And that's what Pyramid Head does. He destroys the vestiges of Mary until James is able to free himself. Pyramid Head represents two themes to James: delusion and masculinity. Firstly, across the course of the game, he kills Maria in front of James over and over again in various gory ways, like, "Hey, are you seeing this? Do you get what I'm trying to communicate to you?" Trying to break James out of his delusion. Secondly, however, Pyramid Head is a fairly hench, silent man with a literally unreadable face. He has been cosplayed probably the most out of any Silent Hill character in history. He has been brought back to the series so many times that Masahiro Ito loudly and publicly despairs his continued existence. And there's an unusual amount of fan art for such a geometric entity. And it's pretty obvious why. He's cool. He's stoic, he's buff, he gets shit done, he wields a massive knife with relative ease. He has sentience and a silent, calculated intelligence that other Silent Hill enemies don't have, and he shags things. And when James realises what he's done to Mary, Pyramid Head just kills himself. He literally cannot be killed by any hands but his own. That's pretty fucking Sigma, my guy. I'm not here to debate whether or not people are missing the point by cosplaying Pyramid Head or creating fan art of him. He's a very cool, drawable character. Rather, I am suggesting that Pyramid Head personifies the kind of masculinity many people desire to emulate, in some ways good and in some ways bad. A study performed by the Samaritans found that during childhood, men in the UK are taught that being manly doesn't emphasize social and emotional skills, suggesting that this has a clear link to men taking their own lives. Dr. Way commented, "The cardinal discovery of my research is that what is often perceived and described as natural to boys is, in fact, not a manifestation of their nature, but an adaptation to cultures that require boys to be emotionally stoic, aggressive, and competitive if they are to be perceived and accepted as real boys." Masculinity, specifically the masculinity that Pyramid Head exudes, symbolizes the worst possible side of James. The side of him that silently moves through the world, the side of him that cannot and will not communicate with nor understand others, and the side of him that sees everyone around him die before he himself takes his own life. I always preferred Valtiel anyway. Pyramid Head visually is the ideal. He is the on-paper masculinity checklist incarnate, but in practice he is nothing but another monster. On the other end of this fragile spectrum we have Eddie, the polar opposite of Pyramid Head, and yet just as much of a reflection of James as anyone else in the game. Men come into the world wanting what every other human wants and have the same capacities as every other human, commented Dr. Way. But then during the teen years they start to disconnect from what they know about themselves and disconnect from each other. Eddie Dombrowski is an extremely volatile, disturbed man, a personality forged by years of intense bullying revolving mostly around his weight and physical appearance. Eddie frequently makes reference to having been laughed at his entire life, a specific trigger for his rage, as we learn when James stupidly asks him whether or not he's nuts in the final moments before Eddie goes absolutely ballistic and tries to pop a cap in him. Eddie's extreme childhood bullying caused him to snap and kill his bully's dog, recounting how he then watched the dog try and chew through its guts in its dying throes. His watching bully, a man clearly realizing that he was in way over his head at that moment, earned himself a bullet to the leg for his troubles before Eddie fled to Silent Hill. Eddie demonstrates the ego of an extremely insecure man. Although he has absolutely no reason to fear or dislike James, he snaps at the mere suggestion that James might find him weird. For Eddie, it is easier to physically overpower others, to delete the problem from his life in a destructive way, than it is for him to do the work he needs to do to overcome years of bullying. I've known a few people in my life who will often shout at you at the first suggestion of confrontation. Being confronted makes them anxious, so they blow up. It's easier for them to scream and rage until you stop talking, forcing the displacement of the issue, but it's toxic. To accept the confrontation and understand that confrontation doesn't always mean aggression is healthy, but it requires restraint and stability. In many things, the healthy choices are harder. They require vigilance, practice, and effort. Eddie is that toxic behavior incarnate, the kind of man who goes ballistic and silences anyone who challenges him, even unintentionally, because it is easier for him to kill a man than it is for him to feel secure in himself and his own masculinity. Like, bullying is bad, it is awful, it will follow you for a long time, but if you refuse to do the difficult work of healing from it, if you continue to lash out at everybody around you for wrongdoing they were never even privy to, Eddie demonstrates that this insecurity will eat you alive. Men's Health magazine defines loneliness as hunger, a lack of emotional sustenance, and I do truly believe that in this regard, Eddie was starving, just like James. Angela Orozco is my favourite character in Silent Hill, and a character I covered extensively in my discussions of Bloober's The Medium, a game that was somehow simultaneously 4 hours long and 4 hours too long. As I've discussed in most of my videos on the Bloober Gameography and my Madison video, yeah, you're getting all the plugs today, my friends, I find suicide endings to be more lazy than they are distasteful. While I appreciate that horror can sometimes end in horrific circumstances, I feel more as though suicide endings are whipped out when the writers realise that they've marched themselves into a narrative corner, or want some cheap and easy shock factor to wrap up a half-baked and unimpressive story. As I mentioned previously, Silent Hill 2 is the only game in the original series that uses suicide as a narrative device, and it is used tragically and thematically, but also sensitively. The in-water ending is not that subtle, but it's still something a more glazed over gamer is going to miss. You would be stunned at how much people miss. I missed this on my first playthrough, although I was like 15, so I guess you can forgive me for that. Moreover, while In Water is canonically a suicide ending, it is still vague enough in its nature that you see people raise compelling arguments for it even today. Maybe James did bail out of the car at the last minute, deployed a teddy bear roll and safely crab walked away from the car as it sank to the bottom of the lake with Mary's body inside. Maybe, maybe not, but it's fun. The same can be said for Angela's ending. Angela is one of the most famous characters in the Silent Hill franchise. She is a 19-year-old girl who James initially meets in the graveyard, but encounters soon after in the Blue Creek apartments, lying on the floor of an empty flat with a huge kitchen knife, staring at herself in the mirror. For all intents and purposes, Angela has already given up. She is merely returning to Silent Hill out of some strange obligation to her mother, a woman who may well be as dead as Mary is, but unlike James, Angela doesn't have it in her to fight anymore. As we learn, she was brutally and repeatedly sexually assaulted by her father and brother. This is mostly revealed to us through her own final boss, the Abstract Daddy, a pulsing, writhing facade of two figures on a bed in a design that isn't so much overt as it is just plainly shown to us. During her first few appearances in Silent Hill 2, I do believe to my core that Angela is salvageable. She is often found contemplating suicide, asking James if he is scared of death, but she's polite, she's amicable, and she doesn't see him as a threat despite her crippling fear of men after a lifetime of sexual abuse. Yet by the time we save her from the Abstract Daddy, a test she fails, and a trial that proves to her that she doesn't have the will to fight anymore, she is completely lost. Angela has become hostile, angry, bitter, and resolute. She screams at James to leave her alone, having closed off any avenue he might have had to reach her with, and when he next sees her in the hotel, she walks off to take her own life. This scene is incredibly well known across the horror gaming sphere, arguably one of the most famous scenes in this circle of gaming horror, and a scene that works so well on so many levels. James approaches Angela, finding her on a staircase that is lit ablaze. We see her framed by two strange skinned bodies on the wall to either side of her, representing her brother and father. She is quieter here, at peace. "It's hot as hell in here," James remarks, and Angela faces him with renewed interest. "It's always like this for me," she says. It's at this point in the story that James finally attempts to coax her back on side, but it's too late. James takes an interest in Angela's well-being the moment he is finally able to see what she is going to do to herself, but she's long since made her decision. She mocks him a little bit before walking up the stairs up into the flames. Is this symbolism for her ascending to heaven out of the flames of her earthly hell? Probably. She walks up the stairs and vanishes from James's life forever. Is she actually going to kill herself? Of course she is, obviously. Angela has killed herself. There is some debate about this since we don't see her or her dead body after the fact, but it's worth remembering two very key things about this situation. The first, James would never bother to go and check for Angela's body, even if the fire was gone. That man spent the entire game looking through her. Checking on Angela's well-being in these final moments probably has the same priority to him as the chores he puts off, like she is the human equivalent of cleaning the gutters every year, something he'll get around to. While James is our protagonist, he's not our hero, and he could not give a shit if he tried. Secondly, and perhaps as a development of the first point, James has done nothing to deserve closure from this situation. After spending the entire time ignoring the obvious red flags in Angela's behaviour, hearing her but not listening when she speaks to him, leaving her to walk the streets of Silent Hill by herself, he has done nothing to earn her final moments. What's he gonna do? Cry? Be sad? Lament the loss of a woman who could have been saved? Well, yes, James didn't owe Angela anything. A morality defined by what we owe others isn't morality, it's transaction. I truly believe that had he taken even a moment to sit with her, Angela's story would have gone very differently, but he doesn't. James, our symbol of male loneliness, is a prime example of the potential to be a hero here, and he squanders it. Why? Selfishness? Ignorance? Both? Instead, James just adopts a facade of Angela's grief as his own, discarding her like you would a pistachio nutshell. Like, this isn't implied, we see this happen, literally. Early in the story, Angela hands James the knife she plans to kill herself with, asking him to hold on to it. From this point, the Pyramid Head enemy will have a new weapon, the Great Knife. Although we have seen Pyramid Head a few times prior to this, he was without a weapon each time. It's only when James has Angela's knife on his person that Pyramid Head has a much larger version of the same knife, demonstrating that Angela has passed her suicidal ideation onto him. Masahiro Ito designed Pyramid Head with James's suicide ending in mind, which only contributes to that theory for me. His thematic, both of James's demise, but also of his propensity to take from the people around him without ever finding a connection. This is exemplified in Masahiro Ito's observations that James did not see the same abstract daddy that Angela fought. He states explicitly that while he did fight a creature in that room, Angela saw something far too horrifying to communicate, whereas James fights a fleshy, low-detailed vestige of that horror. On one hand, you can argue that this is done to encourage players to use their imagination and not be drip-fed every aspect of Silent Hill so as to keep the horror and mystery going, which I agree with. But on the other hand, I think this is so key to James's inability to forge that connection with someone who was right there to be connected with the whole time, that he fails to see her trauma from her perspective even when he's helping her fight it. The real tragedy of James's story, for me, is the preventability of it. Each time I play through the game, I find more and more moments that frustrate me. Every opportunity James has to find meaningful and helpful connections are opportunities that he sleepwalks past, never seems to equate the dire situation with the limited potential allies. He just staggers around asking if anyone's seen his dead wife. Most of the cast go insane and or die, and then James kills himself. Bosh. Silent Hill 2 is a network of tragedy. The tragedy of Mary and her marriage to a man who ultimately murders her. The tragedy of Laura the orphan, never getting closure on the death of the woman who promised to adopt her. The tragedy of Eddie, a lost soul who needed to be put down like the dog he killed. The tragedy of Angela, the person who everyone watched die slowly. And the tragedy of Maria, an object offered to plug the gap left by Mary. But most importantly, it is the tragedy of James Sunderland, a man whose only connection to his humanity was through his wife, a wife he saw as a burden within only a short while of needing to care for her, a woman he was never ready to care for in the first place. It's the tragedy of a man who stumbles past the rest of humanity without even registering its presence, and then falls under the weight of the burden he carries. I mentioned a while ago in the video that I hope that Silent Hill 2 encouraged a few men to take better care of their wives in the wake of playing it, hopefully jarred into awareness by some of the behaviour James might have reflected back to them. But honestly, I'd like to take it a step further. I think James works so fantastically as a horror protagonist because he is A, a cautionary tale, and B, exhibits the kind of behaviour you see in so many men in every facet of life. He is every stereotype of the lonely man, both as imposed by society and from within. He's a man with all his eggs in one basket, his wife, a basket that is crushed before he turns 30 years old, a man who only starts to care about the people around him when they are too far gone to be reached, a man who feigns ignorance so as to avoid responsibility. James teaches us that loneliness is a dangerous hunger, a cold and dark place where bitterness grows like fungus. I'm not a man, and I'm not an expert on how it feels to be a man. Not at all. But I have been watching the discussions around this epidemic flourish, and I look at the men around me and I see bits and pieces of it in all of them. Little enclaves of loneliness, faces of James. I know I'm just some woman, and I can't possibly understand the societal pressure of remaining stoic and emotionally detached. It's easy for me to say, just go out there and build relationships, like it's as simple as that, especially when I'm not the one who has been raised from a young age to reject the value of connection. But I do want you to think about it. Think about where your eggs are, if you have any. Think about how they're distributed. Think about your lifelines and the lifeline you might be for other people. The opportunities you reject because you're tired or you can't be asked, only to walk home and stare at a computer screen until 4 AM with that deep pang of emptiness in your stomach. Look up from the ground, see what you have in front of you and hold on to it, because it's not always going to be there. If you leave it to die, it will die. And always look back at James, a man so lost that he only had one place left to be: in water.